I used to be my daughter's greatest pride, until she was gone and my granddaughter called me a past best left forgotten. I sewed a wedding dress with trembling hands only to be seated next to the housemaid. But when the designer gown tore open, every eye turned to me. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch the next powerful episodes. The morning mist clung to the windows like faded lace, blurring the edges of the world outside. In the quiet house on Hawthorne Street, a single light glowed above an old wooden sewing table where a vintage Singer machine sat in dignified silence. The house, like its occupant, had grown still with age, bones creaking in the floorboards, sighs in the pipes, a draft that always found its way under the door, no matter how many times you sealed it. Margot Ellis, 74 years old, leaned over the sewing table, her silver hair pinned into a loose knot. Her hands, once praised for their elegance and precision, now trembled just slightly as she picked up a spool of gray thread and held it to the light. Not to thread it, just to feel it, to remember. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. On the wall above the sewing table hung a framed photograph, a young woman in a lace wedding gown, laughing wind lifting her veil like a sail. Amelia, her daughter, the one whose laughter used to fill this house like sunlight. Margot didn't allow herself to look at that photo too long anymore. There was something cruel about the way it stayed young while she grew old. She sat down with a soft sigh, reaching for the teacup beside her. Cold again. Always cold. She didn't remember when she had brewed it, only that it had stopped steaming some time ago. That was how the days passed, now quiet, aimless, cold. Then came the sound that broke the stillness, the doorbell. It rang once then, twice urgent but not frantic. Margot rose slowly, her knees protesting, and crossed the hallway, her slippers making soft whispers against the hardwood floor. She peeked through the peephole out of habit, then blinked. Summer. The girl on the porch was wrapped in a tan coat, a scarf fluttering as she turned slightly to glance at the street behind her. Her blonde hair was tied in a high bun, her hands clasped around a small clutch. Summer hadn't been there in months. The last time had been Christmas, and even then it was brief, an exchange of presents and a quick hug before she was off again to a dinner party with her father's side. Margot opened the door. Summer, she said the word catching on her breath. Hi, Grandma. Summer smiled a little too brightly. Can I come in? Margot stepped aside. Of course. Come in, darling. It's cold. Summer's heels clicked softly on the entryway tiles. She stood for a moment looking around as if she barely remembered the place. Margot watched her, noting the sleekness of her coat, the glint of a gold bracelet, the faint smell of expensive perfume. Would you like tea? Margot asked, already moving toward the kitchen. Summer hesitated. Sure, if it's not too much trouble. Margot didn't answer, just smiled gently and set about preparing it. From the kitchen, she glanced toward the living room and saw Summer standing in front of the fireplace, looking up at the photograph of Amelia. I still remember that dress, Summer said. Mom looked like a movie star. She did, Margot murmured, filling the kettle. She loved that day. We all did. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the whistle of the kettle as it began to heat. When Margot returned with the tea, Summer had settled on the sofa, her clutch now resting on her lap like a secret. They drank in silence for a few sips. Summer's eyes kept drifting to the photo. Finally, she placed the teacup on the saucer with a quiet clink and cleared her throat. I came to tell you something. Margot waited. I'm getting married. The words didn't hit Margot like a shock. They settled over her slowly like snow on the shoulders of a statue. She set her cup down carefully, her hands suddenly more steady than they'd been all morning. Oh, Summer offered a small smile, rehearsed polite. His name is Nathaniel Black. We've been dating for about a year. He proposed last weekend. It was beautiful. That's wonderful, dear, Margot said softly. Congratulations. Thank you. Summer's fingers fidgeted with the clasp of her clutch. The wedding is in 6 weeks. So soon? His mother, Darlene, wanted to move quickly. She's helping plan everything. Margot nodded, but a cold knot was already forming in her stomach. I wanted you to hear it from me. Summer added quickly. I didn't want you to find out through Facebook or a neighbor. Margot managed to smile. I appreciate that. There was another pause. Summer seemed to weigh something in her mind, then opened the clutch and pulled out an envelope. A formal invitation, she said, handing it over. We'd love for you to be there. Margot took the envelope in both hands. The cardstock was thick and pearly, embossed with elegant calligraphy. She ran her thumb over her own name, Miss Margot Ellis, as if to be sure it was real. Then she noticed the line beneath Table Family, Tier 3. Tier 3, she asked gently. Oh, Summer said quickly, don't read into that. It's just how the planner categorized it. Close family extended, you know. Margot said nothing. She had read enough invitations in her life to know what Tier 3 meant. I know it's a lot. Summer added, voice growing awkward. The wedding's going to be big, very formal. Darlene has a certain vision. I see. She's really involved, wants everything perfect. Margot looked at her granddaughter. The girl's cheeks were flushed not from excitement but tension. She looked tired, overdressed, underprepared. Margot forced her voice to remain calm. And your dress, do you have one already? Summer nodded. Yes, Darlene ordered it from Paris, some designer I can't pronounce. Margot nodded slowly. Of course. A silence opened between them, heavy, reluctant. Margot wanted to say something more. She wanted to ask why Summer hadn't come to her, why she hadn't asked for help, for guidance, for love, in the one way Margot knew how to give it. She wanted to ask what her daughter would have thought, what Amelia would have said about all of this. But she didn't. Instead, she stood and reached for Summer's empty teacup. I'll get you more, she said. No, I should go. Summer stood too quickly, brushing her coat straight. I have a fitting in half an hour. Margot nodded again. She followed Summer to the door. Thank you for coming by, she said. Summer turned, hesitating. For a moment her face softened, the polish slipped, and the little girl Margot remembered peeked through. I hope you'll come, she said. It would mean a lot to me. Then she was gone, her perfume lingering in the hallway. Margot stood for a long time by the closed-door envelope in hand, the Tier 3 designation glaring back at her like an insult whispered behind her back. She returned to her sewing room and sat down slowly. Her knees cracked. The light flickered. The photo of Amelia looked down at her, silent and eternal. She's getting married, Margot whispered. And she wants me there, but not too close. She looked at the machine. The gray spool still sat there waiting. Her hands reached for it without thinking. She threaded the needle and began to sew. The invitation lay on the coffee table, unopened. Margot stared at it like a stone dropped into her living room. The glossy envelope with its scripted gold lettering caught the late morning light, like it was trying to dazzle her into forgetting what it truly was, a boundary, a label, a reminder of where she stood. Summer, still seated upright on the couch, sipped her tea with an air of practiced calm. Her eyes drifted around the room, barely resting on anything for more than a second. The lace curtains, the shelf of old sewing awards, the wooden cabinet with dust-softened china. Then her gaze fell again on the photograph above the mantel. Amelia, in her wedding dress framed in soft light and unfiltered joy. The smile that lived in that picture didn't exist in this room anymore. Not since that day. Not since everything changed. You have to come, Grandma Summer said gently, her voice skating the edge between a plea and a command. Nathaniel's mother really wants to meet you. Margot looked up. She does. Summer nodded too quickly. Yes. Darlene's very attentive to family dynamics. She's big on appearances. She'll want everyone present, especially you. Because I'm family, Margot said flatly. Of course. Margot glanced down at the envelope again. She reached for it with slow fingers, tore it open with care, and pulled out the card inside. It was beautiful, certainly elegant cursive ivory texture, embossed edges. It smelled faintly of lavender and money. She scanned the names, the venue, the time. Her eyes froze on one line near the bottom, seating family, table of honor, Tier 3. She stared at it. Tier 3, Tier 3. The words rolled around in her head like marbles in a tin. Not table 1, not the head table, not seated beside the bride or the groom. Tier 3. It could have said back row, It might as well have said, "Remember to smile when photographed, but do it from afar." Margot looked up at her granddaughter, who had gone very still. "Tier 3, she asked quietly. Summer's cheeks flushed. "It's just how the wedding planner structured things," she said quickly. "Tier 1 is immediate family me. Nathaniel, his mom, and her husband. Tier 2 is like the bridal party. Nathaniel's siblings, our close friends. Tier 3 is—" She faltered. "People we love but who aren't part of the central logistics." Margot blinked. "Logistics? I didn't write it that way." "The planner did. Darlene said it makes it easier for the servers and photos, and please don't take it the wrong way." "The wrong way," Margot repeated. Summer shifted in her seat, eyes pleading. "I want you there. That's what matters." Margot gave her a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be there," she said. "Of course I'll be there." There was a silence between them then, the kind that grows legs and walks around the room, touching every object with cold fingers. Outside, a truck rolled down the street. A dog barked. The world continued. Inside, Margot turned the invitation over in her hands like she was weighing it. It felt heavier than it should. "You know," she said, her voice low, "when your mother got married, we had only 50 people. No tiers, no lists, just the people who mattered. We made the centerpieces ourselves, hydrangeas and eucalyptus. She said she wanted the wedding to feel like a homecoming." Summer smiled faintly. "I've seen the photos." Margot nodded. "There's one of you. You were only 5. You were holding the train of her dress like it was made of clouds." "I remember that," Summer said, a little. Margot stared at her granddaughter for a long moment. She wanted to tell her how Amelia had made that dress herself. Hand-stitched lace, carefully gathered waist, every pearl sewn into place with love and laughter. She wanted to tell her how proud she'd been, how radiant Amelia had looked walking down that aisle, and how she had whispered to Margot later, "It was perfect, just like I dreamed." But the words caught in her throat. They always did when she thought about the last time she had seen her daughter alive. A sudden flash of memory struck her like lightning across the sky. Rain. The windshield wipers not fast enough. Amelia's voice on the phone cheerful. "I'll be home in 20, Ma. Do you want soup?" And then the silence. Then the knock at the door. Then the officers. The hospital. The white sheet pulled back. The bruised cheek. The blood-stained curls. Gone. She blinked hard, pulling herself back. The room hadn't changed, but the air had. It was heavier now. Her hands trembled slightly on her lap. Summer stood. "I really do have to get going." Margot rose with her, steadied herself. "Thank you for the invitation." Summer hugged her quickly like an afterthought and moved to the door. "I'll send you the registry link," she said. "It's mostly kitchenware and travel things." Margot nodded already, knowing she wouldn't click it. Summer opened the door. "I'll see you at the wedding, Grandma. Please don't be late. It's very timed." "Of course," Margot said, a chill blooming in her chest. And just like that, Summer was gone. Margot closed the door, leaning against it for a long moment. The scent of her granddaughter's perfume still lingered, a floral thing, sweet and heavy like roses left too long in water. She walked back into the living room and sat. The envelope and cards sat where she'd left them, glowing pale in the light like a wound. She stared at them, unblinking. "Tier 3, she whispered. "People we love, but not part of the logistics." Her laugh was dry and brittle. She picked up the invitation and walked into the sewing room. The machine sat quietly, a faithful creature that never betrayed her. The same one she had used to sew her daughter's wedding dress, and the dresses of 100 other women brides who'd wanted something not just beautiful, but meaningful. Margot placed the invitation down on the desk, then opened a drawer and pulled out a small box wrapped in blue ribbon. Inside, tucked in layers of tissue paper, was a spool of fabric, the color of soft ash gray, with the faintest lilac undertone. It shimmered subtly in the light. The last of her mother's imported silk blend, the one Amelia had always wanted her to save. "For something special, Ma," she used to say. "For someone who deserves it." Margot let the fabric unspool a little across the desk. She hadn't sewn anything in years, not since Amelia's funeral, but now she looked at that Tier 3 invitation and something in her spine straightened. If they wanted her quiet in the background, out of the picture, They were about to find out what happened when you underestimated the woman who taught half this town what it meant to be stitched together by hand. She turned to the machine and began to plan. The champagne was French. The glasses were crystal, and the air smelled of roses flown in from somewhere that didn't know winter. Margot Ellis stood just inside the threshold of the private ballroom, her coat still clinging to her shoulders like armor, her clutch purse held with both hands like a lifeline. The engagement party for Summer and Nathaniel Black was, in a word, extravagant. Music floated through the room from a live string quartet, tucked beneath a velvet canopy. Waiters in matching black and gold uniforms moved like chess pieces between clusters of guests, offering hors d'oeuvres too delicate to touch. A chandelier, a constellation of chandeliers, glimmered above it all like royalty staring down on peasants. Margot had dressed simply. A navy dress modestly cut, the same one she wore to Amelia's wake. A brooch, Amelia's pinned at the collar. Practical black flats. She'd brushed her hair into a bun, applied soft lipstick, and left the house with trembling fingers and a quiet hope lodged like a pebble in her chest. Now standing here, she felt like an afterthought in a painting. Grandma Summer's voice, bright but a touch too loud, cut through the buzz. Margot turned. Summer swept in with a radiant smile, her makeup precise, her dress a slinky blush silk that whispered wealth. She kissed Margot's cheek quickly, an air peck more than affection, and gently guided her in. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered, glancing toward the center of the room. "They'll want to meet you." "They?" Margot asked, heart already tightening. "Come," Summer said, taking her hand like she was leading a child across traffic. The guests looked up briefly as they passed, some offering tight smiles, others clearly confused. No one recognized her. No one knew what to say to the quiet older woman in navy. But Margot kept walking, holding her breath as they approached the inner circle. "Mother Summer said this is my grandmother, from my mom's side." Margot barely had time to register the words before the woman turned. Darlene Black was dressed in silver, not the kind of silver that aged. This was sharp metallic, nearly aggressive. Her earrings were diamonds, her heels high, her presence enormous. She looked Margot over the way someone might glance at a weather report before a garden party. "Well," Darlene said with a smile too wide for sincerity, "so this is Margot." Margot extended her hand. "Mrs. Black, it's a pleasure." Darlene took the hand briefly, just enough to be polite, and let it go. "You're from Maine?" "Yes, originally. I've lived in New York State for 40 years. "How quaint," Darlene said, and then turned her attention to a waiter passing by with glasses of wine. Margot felt the sting before she even processed the words. "I'm thrilled Summer could bring you," Darlene said, eyes now scanning the crowd. "Nathaniel and I have been putting so much thought into this wedding. It'll be the event of the season, I'm sure," Margot replied quietly. Darlene turned back to her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've already arranged everything: venue, flowers, catering, lighting. You know those planners need to be micromanaged these days. I keep saying if you want something done right." She trailed off, sipped her wine. "And the dress?" Margot asked, trying. "Ah, yes, the dress," Darlene said, as if it were a secret too delicious to keep. "We've ordered it from Paris. Custom. From a designer who only takes 5 clients a year. Divine craftsmanship. You'll die when you see it." "I see. You do dresses too, I was told." Darlene tilted her head. "Were you a seamstress?" Margot smiled politely. "I was a wedding gown designer. I owned a boutique in Albany for 30 years. "Ah," Darlene nodded, as if that explained something. "Well, I'm sure you'll appreciate the artistry of this one. Though I do hope you're not the sentimental type. Nathaniel prefers modernity." She waved a hand like brushing away cobwebs. Margot forced another smile. "I'm sure it will be beautiful." Darlene leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if to share a confidence. "You know all we need from you is to smile for the camera and enjoy yourself. Just be present. That matters more than you think. Just be present. Be a prop, a placeholder, a seat filled for symmetry." Margot nodded, but she could feel the sting in her chest crawling upward, constricting her breath. She looked at Summer, who was now chatting with one of Nathaniel's sisters and laughing as if she hadn't heard a thing, as if none of it mattered. Margot excused herself quietly and stepped toward the balcony to get some air. She needed space, even if it meant being outside in the cold. The doors opened easily, the air hitting her like a splash of ice water. She exhaled slowly, the condensation drifting into the moonlight. Her hands gripped the railing as the strings of music followed her outside Vivaldi, ironically light. She thought of Amelia then, Amelia on her wedding day barefoot in their garden, clutching wildflowers and laughing because it had rained all morning. She'd said, "It's good luck, Ma. They say rain means the marriage will last." And it had until the crash. Margot closed her eyes and let the memories rush in. The dress she'd made for her daughter, hand-sewn lace seed pearls along the bodice, a row of covered buttons down the back like tiny promises. She'd stitched love into every seam. Amelia had cried when she put it on. "You made me into something magical," she'd whispered. That was the last dress Margot had ever made. The night before the crash, Amelia had left a voicemail. Margot still had it saved on a cassette tucked in a box. "Love you, Ma. Keith wants to paint the nursery blue. I think it's a girl." There was no nursery, no baby, just a gravestone and a silence that had lasted 17 years. The doors behind her creaked. Margot didn't turn. "You all right, ma'am?" a waiter asked softly. She nodded. "Just needed some air." He offered her a glass of water. She accepted it, and then returned to the party. Inside, the music had shifted to something louder. The drinks were flowing faster. Laughter bloomed like wild roses in every corner of the room. Margot found her coat, slipped it back on. Summer saw her from across the room and offered a small wave, distracted her arm looped through Nathaniel's. Margot walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. As she stepped out into the winter night, snow had begun to fall, quiet, respectful. Margot drew her coat tighter. In her mind, a dress began to take shape again. Gray, ash, like memory, like resilience, like morning turned into purpose, and the needle in her hand waiting. The house greeted her in silence the way it always did. No chimes, no voices, just the low hum of winter wind pressing against the windows like fingers wanting in. Margot slipped off her shoes at the threshold and walked to the kitchen without turning on the light. She didn't need it. Every corner of the house had lived with her longer than most people had stayed in her life. The teapot was still half full, cold again. She poured the rest into the sink and refilled it this time with intention. Boiling water, chamomile, something steady, something kind. Her hands trembled more tonight. Not from age, but from restraint. Darlene's voice still rang in her ears, sharp, manicured words slicing through the fog of politeness. "Just be present. We've ordered the dress from Paris. Smile for the camera." She sat at the kitchen table, the tea untouched, and stared out the window at the skeletal trees swaying like dancers in mourning. Then slowly she rose, not quickly, not impulsively, with purpose. She walked into the sewing room. The door had remained closed for years, more out of muscle memory than grief. The room smelled of cedar and linen and time. Everything was still where it had always been, the mannequin covered in dust cloth, the drawers of lace and beads, the wooden cabinet holding her best scissors. She had once hidden chocolate in there from Amelia. Margot stepped to the far corner and knelt creaking with the floorboards. She pulled out a wide, flat box, the kind that belonged in boutiques no one could afford. Inside, wrapped in soft muslin, was a bolt of fabric, the color of memory gray with a hint of lavender, the color of ashes and dusk and secrets kept. She pressed it to her chest for a moment, closed her eyes. The fabric had once belonged to her mother. Imported silk blend. Amelia had always called it the someday cloth. Someday for something special, someday for someone who deserved it. Margot had never cut it, never dared, until now. She placed the fabric on the table and smoothed it out gently with her palms. Her fingers no longer had the speed or strength they once did, but they remembered the language. They remembered how to trace a pattern by touch, how to measure by instinct, how to feel where the stitch should live. She uncovered the sewing machine. The light clicked on harsh and white, unforgiving. It illuminated every wrinkle on her face, every trembling shadow in her hands. But her eyes didn't flinch. Her gaze sharp and focused. For the first time in years, she was awake. She reached for her sketch pad, the one she hadn't opened since Amelia's funeral. On a fresh page she began to draw. The silhouette formed slowly, a vision of elegance without noise. A long flowing skirt-fitted bodice sleeves made of whispering lace. The neckline gentle, the waist delicately gathered. Not modern, not trendy, timeless, like love that had endured. Not the kind of dress you wear for society pages. The kind you wear when you want to be remembered by someone who matters. Margot leaned back, blinking at the design. She saw Summer in it, not the Summer she'd just left at the party, surrounded by opulence and strangers, but the girl who used to spin barefoot in the garden. The girl who once stitched buttons onto a pillow with crooked joy. The girl who had cried when her mother died and buried her face in Margot's neck. She took a breath and began. The scissors made the first cut, clean, deliberate. The sound echoed in the still room like the first note of a requiem. Then the pins came out, the measuring tape. The mannequin was stripped bare and redressed in hope. She worked into the night, her tea long cold, her limbs aching. At one point she reached for a thread and had to pause as her hand spasmed. But she breathed through it. She adjusted, adapted. Her stitches were slower now, less confident, but no less filled with meaning. At 1:12 a.m., she opened her journal. Not the one for taxes or recipes or dates she might forget. The real one. The one Amelia never knew about. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "If she doesn't wear it, that's all right. I'm not sewing for a ceremony. I'm sewing for something older. I'm sewing so she remembers someone once loved her enough to count every thread, to place every pearl with trembling fingers. I'm sewing because I have to, because this is the only language I still speak fluently. And if she never wears it, if she never even sees it, at least I will know. I didn't stay silent." She closed the journal. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but her chest had never felt lighter. She returned to the machine, pressed her foot gently to the pedal, and the hum returned, the familiar lullaby of creation. The needle danced, and Margot in that quiet room was no longer 74, no longer grieving, no longer invisible. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman with something to give, and thread by thread she stitched herself back into the world. Morning light filtered through the blinds like ribbons of mercy. Margot sat in the sewing room, the scent of lavender and starch still lingering in the air. The dress stood on the mannequin like a memory reborn, shimmering quietly in the soft gray light, subtle in its elegance, humble in its design, but unmistakably crafted with reverence. She was brushing invisible lint from the bodice when she heard the knock. Soft, hesitant. Margot rose slowly, palms brushing against her skirt as if to erase nerves. She opened the front door. Summer stood there, hair tied in a low knot, hands hidden behind her back. "Hey, Grandma," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come in," Margot said, gently stepping aside. Summer walked into the house with that same unease, like someone entering a place where too much had been remembered. Her eyes swept over the pictures on the wall, the worn-down carpet, the tray of tea Margot had prepared, though she hadn't known if Summer would come. Summer glanced toward the sewing room. "Is that—" "Yes," Margot said. She didn't wait. "Come, I want to show you something." She led her to the room, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. Summer stepped into the space like it was sacred, and in some ways it was. Her eyes landed on the dress, soft, long, dignified in its simplicity, and she instinctively reached out. "You made this," she whispered. "I did." Margot nodded, hands folded. Summer ran her fingers down the sleeve. "It's beautiful," she said, and then added almost guiltily, "It looks like something from a storybook." Margot chuckled quietly. "Maybe it is. Maybe it's a story I've been waiting to finish for a long time." She paused, then took a breath, walked to the other side of the mannequin, and held the skirt gently in her hands. "It's not Paris," she said. "No designer label. No cameras will fight to capture it. But every stitch in this dress, every thread, is mine. I thought maybe you'd want to wear something made with love." Summer swallowed. Her eyes flickered with something: hesitation, gratitude, fear. "Grandma," she began, voice uncertain. I really do love it. I mean, I can tell how much heart you put into it, and I appreciate that more than I can say," but Margot didn't move. Her smile didn't change, but her spine straightened, a woman preparing herself for an answer she already feared. They've already had the dress flown in. Summer continued, words tumbling, now awkward and thin. This whole thing has gotten so complicated, and Darlene's been planning it for months. She's intense. I don't want to upset the flow. She looked up, her eyes glossy. It's not that I don't love what you made, I do, It's all right, Margot interrupted softly. You don't need to explain. No, but Sweetheart, Margot said, her voice even, but her hands had dropped to her sides. I understand. I truly do. Summer blinked. Are you sure? Margot nodded. Of course. A pause. Long enough for Summer to believe it. Long enough for her to feel she had handled it gracefully. Maybe I could wear it for something else, Summer said, reaching for an olive branch. Like the rehearsal dinner, maybe, Margot said, forcing a polite smile. The silence that followed was louder than the sewing machine had ever been. Summer looked around the room once more, then back at Margot. I really do love you, Grandma. I know, Margot replied, placing a hand on Summer's cheek. It was warm, fleeting. I should go, Summer said. They're expecting me back at the hotel. Margot nodded and walked her to the door. When Summer stepped outside, the wind lifted her scarf and she turned back once. Thank you, she said. For everything. Margot waved. Take care, my dear. She closed the door, locked it, and stood there, her hand still on the knob. For a long time she didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the wood, as if it would open and bring Summer back, not with excuses, but with tears and arms wide open, like the child who once ran through this house with cookie dough on her fingers. But the door didn't move. Neither did she until her knees gave out. She walked slowly back into the sewing room, and her legs trembled with each step. When she reached the mannequin, she stood before it for a moment, just looking. The dress hadn't changed. Still perfect in its quiet elegance, still waiting to be loved. She reached out and touched the bodice again. Then gently she pulled the dress from the form. She held it to her chest the way she had once held Summer as a baby Amelia, after nightmares herself, on nights when everything felt like too much. And then she began to cry. Not the loud kind, not the theatrical kind. The quiet, aching kind. The kind that hurts the throat and swells behind the eyes until the body simply can't hold it anymore. She sank into the chair beside the window, the dress still clutched against her. Tears soaked into the silk as the light shifted across the floorboards. Minutes passed, then hours. At some point, the tea she had poured that morning was still sitting on the table untouched. She leaned forward, pressing the dress tighter to her chest, and whispered, it's okay, I just wanted her to know. I remembered. Outside wind brushed through the trees. A bird flew past the window. The sun retreated behind a thick sheet of clouds. And in that dim room where love had been stitched but not worn, Margot closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in a moment of mourning. Not for the dress, not for the rejection, but for the space between them, the one that no lace, no thread, no careful hem could bridge. It was the kind of morning that dripped opulent sky, the color of powdery silk sun, catching every polished surface of the sprawling Darlene estate. Everything shimmered as if touched by a cinematographer's hand. The garden, manicured to mathematical perfection, bloomed in curated pastels. Waiters moved like clockwork shadows, rehearsing their paths with silver trays. Margot Ellis stood outside the front gate, gripping her small beige clutch like a lifeline. Her hat, the same one she'd worn to her daughter's funeral, sat too properly on her head. She'd chosen a muted dress, tasteful, conservative, the color of pewter rain. The valet didn't ask for her name. They didn't need to. She was the old woman who didn't belong. As guests spilled into the estate, their laughter rising like confetti, Margot followed slowly, walking past towers of roses and strings of golden lanterns. Classical music floated through the air, a quartet hidden somewhere behind a trellis, playing a song Margot couldn't name. Inside the estate, the hall opened like a magazine, spread marble floors, chandeliered ceilings, ice sculptures shaped like swans. Everything sparkled except her. A young attendant with a clipboard greeted her at the entrance. She barely looked up. Name, she asked. Margot Ellis, she answered. The girl's eyes flicked toward the clipboard, finger scanning. You're at table 14, garden level. Margot hesitated. Isn't the family sitting? Yes, ma'am. You're at 14, the girl repeated, pointing toward a narrow hallway that led to the outside patio. Table 14 wasn't a table. It was a folding setup near the caterer's tent, where steam from chafing dishes clouded the view of the ceremony lawn. Her companions, 2 gardeners, a delivery driver, and a woman in a catering apron on break, still chewing gum. Margot sat. No one noticed. She adjusted the hem of her skirt, pretending it mattered. The music changed, signaling the start. Everyone flocked to their seats. Across the lawn, the officiant climbed onto the raised dais beneath an arch of imported orchids. Margot could barely see it. But then came a hush, collective reverent. Heads turned, cameras lifted. Summer appeared. She stood at the top of the stairs like something out of Vogue porcelain skin-white silk, catching the light in waves. The Parisian gown sculpted her like it had been poured over her frame. The veil was gossamer. Her heels sparkled like diamonds. Everyone gasped, except Margot. She watched not the dress, but the eyes. Summer's eyes weren't joyful. They were scanning nervous, sharp flitting from guest to guest as though searching for an exit. Darlene, poised in her custom gown, smiled with satisfaction from the front row. She clutched a glass of champagne like a trophy already celebrating a win. As the music swelled, Summer descended the stairs. The train of the gown was carried by 2 flower girls. Her father, Margot's ex-son-in-law, offered his arm with stiff pride. They passed right by table 14. Summer didn't look. Margot didn't wave. The ceremony unfolded in pristine choreography. Vows were read. Rings exchanged. The crowd sighed, applauded, rose to its feet. Margot stayed seated. She reached into her bag, removed a small handkerchief, and dabbed the corner of her eye, though whether it was sweat or sorrow, not even she could say. At the reception, guests danced in a crystal-lit ballroom. Champagne flowed like water. A jazz band played modern covers of old standards. The cake was 7 tiers tall. Margot wandered to the edge of the crowd, standing near a row of hedge sculptures shaped like horses. She watched from behind the blur guests, taking selfies, laughter, ricocheting speeches being made. No one introduced her. No one invited her to dance. Even the servers stopped offering hors d'oeuvres her way, as if the outline of her body had blurred too far from relevance. Then she saw Summer again alone on the dance floor. She swayed gently as her groom talked to investors near the bar. Her veil had slipped. Her heels looked too tight. Her smile flickered like a bad connection. Margot thought of the ash-gray dress now folded in tissue paper back home in the closet where she'd kept her wedding gown once upon a time, a relic. A gesture, a secret offering never accepted. Then came the moment that finally cracked something. A man passed by with a camera crew, a wedding memories team. "Any special guests you'd like us to focus on?" he asked Darlene. Darlene didn't miss a beat. Just the immediate family. Everyone else is ornamental. The cameraman turned. His lens hovered near Margot for a moment, uncertain, then turned away. Ornamental. That was what she'd become. Not a mother, not a grandmother. Just a wrinkle in the linen. She stood motionless, holding a glass of untouched rosé. The bubbles had already died. Someone bumped her shoulder, didn't say sorry. Another stepped on her foot, didn't notice. And still Margot stayed. Not because she hoped to be acknowledged, but because she'd promised herself she would. She'd show up. She'd witness, even if she was invisible. Even if the girl in the white dress was too far gone to remember that the woman at table 14 once taught her how to sew on a button. Once held her when she had nightmares. Once told her bedtime stories in a rocking chair that still creaked in the attic. Even if the last thing Margot ever made with trembling fingers and failing eyesight was now lying in the dark untouched. The ash-gray dress, a prayer with seams, a promise stitched into silence. Margot sat back down. The music rose again, the crowd cheered, and the woman who gave life to a lineage sat alone with her quiet grace, watching it all pass her by. The ballroom had reached that sacred stillness. The air was heavy with perfume and anticipation. Chandeliers dimmed to a warm, romantic glow as the quartet's final note trailed into silence. Guests leaned forward. Glasses clinked. Phones hovered mid-air. Summer stood under the orchid arch, her groom beside her, fingers interlocked in ceremonial precision. The officiant smiled gently and turned the page. "And now he said the rings." Summer inhaled. And then it happened. A sound small but sharp, a snap, followed by a soft tearing hiss. Everyone heard it. A seam split, then another. The silk of Summer's Paris gown gave way at the hip like wet paper. A jagged tear snaked from her waist downward, exposing the boning beneath and a glimpse of her thigh. Gasps erupted across the crowd. Summer froze. The officiant paused mid-sentence. The groom blinked, unsure whether to move. Summer reached down instinctively to cover herself, hands trembling, eyes wide. The tear widened. Silence morphed into panic. Cameras lowered. Someone's champagne flute crashed to the ground. A child laughed, not understanding the stakes. Darlene was the first to shout. "Oh my God!" she screamed, leaping from her seat like she'd been stabbed. The dress. The dress. Someone get. Why is no one doing anything? Summer clutched the gown's edge, twisting awkwardly, as if she could sew it shut with her bare hands. The stylist rushed forward and stopped halfway, realizing she had no tools, no thread, no backup. "There's no second dress," the wedding planner shrieked, already crying frantically, swiping at her iPad. "Why don't we have a second dress? Oh my God, the press, there are bloggers here. This is a disaster." "Fix it!" Darlene shrieked, at no one in particular. "Fix it now." Summer turned eyes searching. For help, for escape, for her mother. But her mother wasn't there. She never had been. Then her eyes met the back of the room. Table 14. Margot had already risen. Her clutch was in one hand calm, her hat pinned perfectly. She moved forward slowly, her footsteps silent on the parquet floor, the crowd parting like uncertain tide. Whispers swirled around her like smoke. What is she doing? Isn't that the grandmother? Does she even know what's happening? Margot walked until she reached the aisle. Then she stopped, and in a voice soft but unmistakable she spoke. "I have a dress." The air shifted. Everyone turned. Summer stared. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Darlene, furious and red-faced, snapped. "What are you talking about?" Margot didn't flinch. "I made one, for her, just in case." Darlene laughed bitterly. "You mean that rag you were stitching in your living room?" Margot turned to Summer. "It's simple. Ash gray. It's not from Paris, but it fits." Summer didn't speak. "Put a jacket over it," Darlene hissed to a planner. "We can salvage the photos." But Summer was already moving. She stepped away from the arch, from her groom, from the audience, her silk dress slipping as she walked toward her grandmother. The room fell still again. Summer stopped in front of Margot. "I didn't even try it on," she whispered. "You don't have to," Margot said gently. "It knows you." Summer blinked and something in her expression cracked. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything." Margot didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her clutch and pulled out the ash-gray dress folded in cream tissue. "I kept it with me," she said, "because I knew this dress might be needed before the night was over. And not just by you." Summer looked down at the package, then back at the sea of eyes watching. Then she nodded. A tear rolled down her cheek. The planner ushered them toward the estate dressing room, tripping over her own heels. As Summer disappeared into the hallway, the ballroom murmured, "Did that really just happen? Who brings a second wedding dress? Was this planned?" Margot stood alone under the arch. For the first time that day, the spotlight found her, and she did not move. She waited silently dignified, as if she belonged there all along. Because she did, and maybe now everyone would see it. Maybe now someone would remember. Backstage, the air was thick with perfume panic and pin-drop silence. The wedding planner had vanished. Darlene stood like a general without her troops, jaw clenched, arms crossed, lips trembling from suppressed rage. Summer stood motionless in front of a long mirror, her torn white silk gown still clinging to her like a ghost she couldn't peel off. Margot stood beside her, composed and still. She unfolded the ash-gray dress, carefully smoothing each fold with her aging fingers. The fabric shimmered softly under the vanity lights, not loud, not ostentatious, but alive with grace. It was the color of morning fog, of ashes after warmth. A dress stitched with memory. "If you trust me," Margot said quietly, "put this on." Summer turned toward her, eyes red-rimmed. "They'll laugh. Darlene, she'll..." "Let her." Margot's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "But you'll walk down that aisle as yourself, not as someone purchased, but someone loved." There was a beat of silence. Then Summer nodded, small, uncertain, but real. Margot smiled. She reached for the zipper on the ruined gown and helped ease it off, just as she had once helped Amelia out of her school uniforms decades ago. There was a tenderness in every movement. She helped Summer into the ash-gray dress, fastening each hook with hands that trembled not from age, but from the weight of the moment. She smoothed the skirt with her palm eyes meeting Summer's in the mirror. "You were always meant to wear this," Margot whispered. Summer took a shaky breath. It's perfect. You're perfect." Outside the door, the murmur of guests grew restless. A violinist plucked a nervous note. Someone knocked softly. A cousin, a planner. A reminder that time waits for no healing. Summer stood still. "Are you ready?" Margot asked. "No." A pause. "But I will be." And with that, Summer took Margot's hand. Together they walked down the narrow hallway toward the ballroom doors. The usher blinked as he saw them, clearly unsure if this was a cue or a mistake. But Summer didn't stop. She adjusted the simple floral comb in her hair. No veil, no diamonds. Just her, the ash-gray dress, and something real flickering in her spine. The doors opened. The room went silent, not from reverence but confusion. People turned in their seats, eyes narrowing. Darlene's mouth fell open. But no one moved. Summer stood beneath the arch once more, her new husband staring at her as if for the first time. In the dim amber light, the ash-gray gown glowed, not because it sparkled, but because it belonged. There were no beads, no crystals, no stitched initials from foreign ateliers. Just thread and fabric and hands that had loved her long before she was born. The room remained still, until someone, it's never clear who, began to clap. A single pair of hands, then another. Then more, and then the room erupted. Applause like thunder. Summer smiled through her tears. The groom exhaled, took her hand again, and whispered, "Now you're here." Margot stood off to the side, half-shadowed, watching everything. Not smiling, not crying, just present. Witnessing. The officiant cleared his throat again. "Shall we begin?" And this time when the vows were said, no one looked at the dress. They looked at the girl. And the grandmother standing behind her, invisible to many, but never to the one who mattered most. The crowd had dispersed. The laughter faded down the driveway like mist chased by evening breeze. Guests filtered toward their cars' heels, clicking on marble voices trailing into the dark. Inside the house, the ballroom lights dimmed one by one. Shadows began to fill the corners, as if the celebration had only borrowed this space for a few hours, and now it wanted its stillness back. Margot stood alone near the archway where Summer had spoken her vows. Her hand gently traced the edge of a wooden column where fresh rose petals had fallen and been crushed underfoot. Her ash-gray dress blended into the wall, unremarkable, invisible, as always, until the click of heels cut through the silence behind her. Darlene, not rushing now, not panicking, calm, calculated, a woman walking into a boardroom, the queen regaining her throne. "Do you even know what you've done?" Darlene's voice was sharp, honed like the edge of a letter opener. Margot didn't turn. "I believe," she replied slowly, "I salvaged a moment your French tailor couldn't guarantee." Darlene scoffed. "You sabotaged her look, that dress gray. Really, you stole her day." Margot turned now, finally facing her. Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired, piercing. A kind of strength that didn't need to shout. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I gave her a way to stay standing. Something stitched with love, not contracts." Darlene's lip curled. She was supposed to walk out in Vera Lemoine, not some hand-sewn memory from a woman with shaky hands. Margot stepped forward, her voice lowered. She was supposed to feel beautiful, not buried. You dressed her like a trophy in a glass box. Darlene's composure cracked. "Don't talk to me about love," she hissed. "You weren't even invited to the rehearsal dinner. Summer barely speaks of you." "I know," Margot replied quietly. "She's been trained not to." The words landed like ice water. Darlene's eyes narrowed. "You think this little moment earns you a seat back at the table? You're just a chapter we skipped." Margot's smile was gentle, not mocking, not cruel, but deeply certain. "I didn't do it to be remembered." Darlene paused, blinked as if surprised. Margot continued. "I did it so my granddaughter remembers herself. Not the version shaped by money, or pressure, or shame." Her hands folded neatly in front of her. "She'll remember this dress, not because it sparkled, but because someone made it for her with nothing but love." Darlene crossed her arms, faltering. "You act like that's noble. You think weddings are about sentiment. They're about legacy, appearances. This wasn't your moment. It never was, Margot agreed. But I made sure it was hers. A silence, a long one. The kind of silence where neither woman would blink first. Then Margot took a small step back. She glanced toward the grand staircase where Summer and her new husband had disappeared. Her voice was nearly a whisper now, but every word struck deep. She may never say thank you, not out loud. But she'll remember that someone stood quietly behind her, someone who didn't need credit, didn't need the spotlight, just loved her fiercely. Darlene's jaw clenched. You always did think you were better than the rest of us, with your sad little stories and your old-fashioned ideals. No, Margot said. Her voice dropped. I just think some things aren't for sale. Darlene opened her mouth, but nothing came out. In that moment, for the first time, she looked unsure, small even, not defeated but seen. Margot gave a small nod, like a bow that didn't require an audience. Then she turned and began to walk toward the side exit. Darlene didn't follow. She just stood in the empty room among wilting petals and flickering candles, surrounded by a silence far louder than applause. Margot paused briefly at the door. Without turning back, she spoke one final line, soft, direct, irreversible. When the shimmer fades, she'll remember who sewed her back together. Then she stepped out into the cool night, the ash-gray dress moving like smoke behind her, as if she'd never been there at all. The celebration was still going on downstairs. The sound of clinking glasses and muffled laughter filtered faintly through the floorboards of the bridal suite. Summer pushed open the door, her hands trembling, cheeks flushed with adrenaline, the ash-gray dress still hugging her frame like it had always belonged there. Inside the room, the vanity lights buzzed softly. The space was quiet now, abandoned like a stage after the last bow. On the dressing table, between scattered makeup brushes and a pair of discarded pearl earrings, lay something out of place, an envelope. Cream-colored, handwritten. She stepped closer. Her name was written in cursive, to Summer, from grandmother. She stood there for a beat, her breath catching. Slowly she opened it. My dearest Summer, by the time you read this, I'll be on the road. Maybe watching the sunrise somewhere quieter. Maybe just heading home. I didn't come today to be honored. I came because you asked, and I stayed because I hoped just maybe you'd need me. Not for the dress or the seating chart, just for love. You looked beautiful. Not because of the silk, but because I saw Amelia in you. The same light in your eyes, the same worry in your smile. And when the dress tore, I knew it wasn't the end of the world. Just a tear. Something a good needle could mend. Happiness isn't perfect lace or applause. It's quieter than that. It's knowing deep down that someone would stay up nights just to sew you back together, even if you never wear the dress, even if you never say thank you. I hope today you felt that. I hope you carry it with you, not the fabric but the truth, because love is not loud, but it never leaves a room without leaving a trace. All my stitches always, Grandma Margot. Summer stared at the page, the words blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She sank slowly into the velvet stool, holding the letter like it was spun from glass. Her makeup smudged, her breath hitched. Downstairs the music changed to a slow waltz. Someone called her name from the staircase, but she couldn't move. She grabbed her phone. Fingers trembling, she found Margot's number and hit call. 1 ring, 2. Voicemail. The recorded voice played, "This is Margot Ellis. I'm not here. Leave something worth coming back for." The line beeped. "Grandma," she whispered, voice cracking. "Please, please pick up." Silence. The call ended. Outside, the sky had shifted to dusk. A faint gold trimmed the clouds. Far down the road, past the garden gates, and out beyond the fields, a gray sedan moved slowly along the highway, the taillights soft like embers fading. Margot didn't look back. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. Her eyes were focused ahead, and in her lap, tucked beside her old leather bag, sat a thimble. Silver, a little tarnished, but still catching the last light of the day. She drove on, and the ash-gray dress and the woman who made it became a quiet legend stitched into the seams of memory. 1 month had passed. The coastal town where Margot now lived smelled of sea salt and fresh linen. It was quieter than the city, warmer than the house she left behind. and just loud enough in the mornings with the laughter of seagulls and the rhythmic flapping of white laundry on balcony lines. She'd found a new rhythm here, a small apartment above a florist with a sunlit room facing the ocean. But most importantly, she'd found a space to begin again, not as someone's grandmother, not as someone's past, but as Margot Ellis, a woman with calloused hands, a sharp eye, and stories sewn into every wrinkle. The small community center was no grand atelier. It had one long wooden table, a set of folding chairs, and a wall with hooks where fabric samples hung like paintings. The floor creaked in places, and the old radio only played jazz from the 40s, but it was perfect. Every Tuesday and Thursday she taught sewing classes to women her age, some widows, some divorced, some just lonely women who hadn't held a needle in decades, if ever. Margot welcomed them all with the same words. We're not here to make perfect seams. We're here to remember we're still capable of mending, and they did. Together they stitched their stories into pillowcases, aprons, little dresses for granddaughters. The room became a sanctuary humming with shared silence, whispered regrets, and loud laughter. On one wall, framed in soft light from the window, hung the ash-gray wedding dress, not in a display case, not behind glass. It hung gently like a reminder. It was late Thursday afternoon. The last student had left with a bundle of fabric and tears of laughter in her eyes. Margot stayed behind, sweeping loose threads off the floor. She was humming some old Ella Fitzgerald tune when the bell above the door rang. She looked up. It was Summer, hair windswept, eyes tired, dressed down in jeans and a cardigan that looked borrowed. In her hands, a small worn box. For a second, neither of them moved. Just the sound of the waves through the open windows and a gust of briny air. I didn't think you'd come, Margot said softly. I wasn't sure I deserved to, Summer replied, stepping closer. Margot nodded, then turned back to the table. That doesn't mean you weren't welcome. Summer placed the box on the table. I found this, in the back of your old armoire, the night after the wedding. Margot opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in yellowing tissue, was a spool of thread. Faded lilac, the exact shade Margot had used for the hem of Amelia's first communion dress. Her fingers hovered over it. I thought this was lost. I kept it, Summer said. I didn't understand why at the time, but now I think I do. Margot's throat tightened. Do you? Summer nodded, tears filling her eyes. You weren't trying to make me wear a dress. You were trying to tell me I was still sewn into your life. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't cold. It was full. Summer stepped around the table and embraced her, not like a girl who felt guilty, but like a woman who finally understood the weight of someone's love, love that never asked for thanks, only a place to rest. They stood like that for a long moment. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting everything in warm golden tones that caught in the soft tulle of the gray dress and made it glow like embers. Later, as they shared tea in chipped porcelain mugs, Summer asked Will, "You teach me?" Margot raised an eyebrow. "To sew. To listen," Summer corrected, smiling through her tears. "With my hands." Margot chuckled, a laugh low and warm from the belly. "Then you'll need calluses and patience." "I'll trade my phone for a thimble," Summer said. They both laughed, and as the camera slowly pulled away from the window, catching the silhouette of two women, one aged, one blooming, sitting across from each other in a room full of thread and light. Margot's voice returned gentle and wise. Life was never meant to be stitched perfectly, only mended bravely when the seams give way.